Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. Welcome to our Bible study in Ezra chapter 7. This is a key chapter because we finally get to meet someone who maybe you expected to meet in the first chapter, and that is Ezra. We're over halfway through now, and finally in chapter 7, we get to meet the guy who the book is named after. We have what I hope is a very informative PDF that has all the key details on it that we use for these studies. You can download it for free at tobelikechrist.com if you want. Let's talk about our first section on that PDF, when. I don't think I'm going to go through all of the dates for today. I think we're just going to cover the last couple here on this list. So in the last chapter, we talked about the temple finally being completed about 516 BC, about 500 years before Jesus. Now we're going to skip forward about 60 years or so to 457 BC. Ezra is finally going to arrive in Jerusalem. So just keep in mind, between chapter 6 and chapter 7, there is a couple decades there. Our key characters, we have, of course, the captives of Judah who spent 70 years in captivity in Babylon, and now they are returning to the promised land, but they're returning in waves. So there were some that came with Zerubbabel. Now there's another group that Ezra is going to come with, and so they come back progressively. It's not an all-at-once kind of thing. These people became known as the Jews as they were living in the land of Judah. All right. Now we have another guy named Artaxerxes in the text, and for clarification, I've named him Artaxerxes Longimanus. That's good enough on our outline. Now, why have I done that? Well, it's because Artaxerxes has already been mentioned in the text several decades previous to this. So are we talking about the same guy, or is this somebody different? It's somebody different. It's another king of Persia down the line. And from what I understand about the names that are given to the kings of Persia, this term Artaxerxes does not necessarily refer to just one ruler, but rather it's a title that's given to the rulers of Persia. So the Artaxerxes who we read about before is different from this Artaxerxes Longimanus in the story here of Ezra. These Persian kings can be tricky because they have several names, and I think here, when we look at this Artaxerxes as a title, think of it as like the title of Pharaoh. Pharaoh can refer to a number of different kings of Egypt. You have to get a little bit more specific to know exactly which one, so you got to dig into the history, which is what I've done here and come up with this particular Artaxerxes. So he's king of Persia from 464 to 424 BC. And then we have Ezra. Ezra is a priest and a scribe who is skilled in the laws of God as he delivered them to Moses. So he's a student of the law. He's also going to be a teacher of the law. And now down to our map. We'll make this as brief as possible today. Basically, Ezra is going to travel from Babylonia, which you see over towards the right side of the map. He's going to now make the journey to Jerusalem. He's going to follow the rivers, most likely, the Euphrates River up to the northwest, and then drop back down along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and go to Jerusalem. It's a trip that takes him several months. Now it's time to scoot on over to our outline section. We've got 28 total verses today. I've got it broken down into two sections. The first one is verses 1 through 10. Ezra travels to Jerusalem, or at least he makes preparations to travel to Jerusalem, verses 1 through 10. As I mentioned, chapter 7 skips forward about 60 years. Now this new king, Artaxerxes, is on the throne. We're here introduced to Ezra, who is a scribe, and he's from the priestly family. He's a descendant of the high priest Aaron, the first high priest, the brother of Moses. So he's in those priestly families, and it says that he's very skilled in the law of Moses. He's very well studied. He knows the law of God really well, and that's going to make him a great tool for going back and teaching the people in the promised land, and that's what he intends to do. Interestingly, Ezra had a really good relationship with the king of Persia, and part of that was because God's blessing was on him. Ezra decides to to leave Babylonia and to go back to Judah and to Jerusalem with a company of exiles that departed in the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign. And his intention was to teach God's law and statutes to his people that were there in Judah. This brings us to section number 2, verses 11 through 28, Artaxerxes' letter. Artaxerxes wrote a letter, and he gave it to Ezra to take back to Judah. The letter included several decrees regarding the exiles and Jerusalem, and even Ezra himself. It gave permission to any Israelite who wanted to return to the land of Israel to do so. Artaxerxes also decreed that silver and gold were to be given to Ezra and to his company to fund sacrifices at the temple. The royal treasury was to supply Ezra and the temple with anything that they needed up to a certain price: 100 talents of silver, 100 cores of wheat, 100 baths of wine, 100 baths of oil, and salt without measure. The priests, the Levites, the temple singers, the doorkeepers, and the temple servants were exempted from taxes. That'd be nice. I'd like to know how I can get that tax exemption somehow. Now we're told that Artaxerxes decreed these things in part to win favor, or at least to avoid the anger of the God of Jerusalem, according to verse 23. Ezra was charged with a job when he got back to Judah. He was charged with appointing judges and magistrates over the people and then teaching them the law of God. Ezra was given legal authority to punish anyone who refused to keep God's commandments. And so that's kind of the end of the decree and the instructions from Artaxerxes. And then we get to the last two verses of the chapter. And in these last two verses, Ezra, first of all, praises God for using the king of Persia in such a marvelous way to benefit his people. And then he gathers up the leaders of the Israelites and he prepares them and himself to begin making the journey back to Judah. So that's what we'll talk about in the upcoming chapters. Another caravan going back to the Promised Land. So that's our summary of Ezra chapter 7. Let's go ahead and talk about an application from this. Though the corporate worship or the official temple worship had already been reestablished at the temple, they were offering sacrifices, the priests were ministering and things like that, Ezra still wanted to return home to teach God's instructions to all of the people. The temple worship and the priests who administered there, that wasn't the only thing that mattered. God's law was supposed to permeate the hearts of his people and to change their personal lives, making them distinct from the nations around them, even when they were away from the temple and even if they weren't priests. What we find out later in the book of Ezra is that hasn't happened. They're really just intermixing and becoming like all of the people around them when it comes to their lives outside of temple work. And I think this is an important principle to keep in mind even in the modern day. There are some churches that are overwhelmingly focused on what happens in the corporate worship or the worship assembly, the worship gathering on Sunday morning. But really, they're not that concerned about whether their people are distinct from the world between Monday and Saturday. As we see in Ezra's desire to go home, there's more to God's word than just the instructions about how to worship God properly at the temple or in a church building. And we need Ezras to remind us of that. We need people to teach us how to live holy and distinct lives when we leave our worship gatherings. God's instructions about worship are no more important than his instructions about how to be Christ-like on the weekdays. If our whole identity is tied up in how we worship on Sunday, but not in how we live on Monday, we're missing some key instructions from God. And the reason I bring this up is because you'll come across churches sometimes that they are so strict, they are so adamant about doing absolutely everything within a worship assembly according to the scriptures. They want book, chapter, verse for everything. They want biblical authority for everything, and that's a good thing. But then sometimes there's open sin in their congregation. There's people living and basically living like the rest of the world. And they say, well, we don't really want to confront that. We don't really want to do anything about that. Kind of as long as we're doing everything in our corporate assemblies that's right, we're not going to touch that stuff that goes on throughout the week. So they're sticklers about the worship service, but when it comes to like the leadership, the eldership, watching over people outside of the church and helping them to live holy lives and be distinct from the world around them, they're kind of like, it's not really that big of a deal. They would, of course, never admit that, but that's what is portrayed through their actions. They're really concerned about keeping the worship assembly pure, but then when it comes to the lives of the believers outside of the building and keeping their lives pure, it's not as much of a priority. I've seen in churches where you'll have elders who would have a conniption if anyone brought anything unbiblical into a worship service. But then when their own children or their own grandchildren are living in open rebellion to God during the weekdays, they're not going to confront it. We don't want to be like that. The application from this is that let's hold ourselves to a high standard in the way that we worship corporately. We absolutely want to do that. And let's hold ourselves to a high standard in the way that we mimic Christ in our personal lives and what happens in that Monday to Saturday time frame, making sure that we are indeed distinct from the world around us.